In August 1981, 91-year-old Henry Walsh was held up at knifepoint in his small hardware store at Ormskirk, Lancashire, in England. The elderly shopkeeper refused to yield to his 18-year-old assailant. He would pay with his life in the most horrific way.
Obviously threatened him with a knife 2 or 3 times. You could see minor marks in his clothing. And then he just pushed it through his chest. And he was actually hanging on it on the door.
The perpetrator was Andrew Dawson, a known local thief who'd suddenly matured into a vicious murderer. He would spend the next 17 years behind bars, but that did nothing to dull his killer instinct.
Almost as inevitably as night follows day, Dawson was going to kill again. It was only a question of when.
Almost 30 years after his first killing, Dawson was a free man with murder on his mind. In 2010, police in Derby would discover 2 of Dawson's neighbours dead, but the convicted killer was nowhere to be found.
This guy kept me awake at night because you just had this feeling that you had to get the evidence. You had to put him away because he was an absolute danger to anybody in society.
Andrew Dawson had proved himself to be one of the world's most evil killers. In July 2011, Andrew Dawson pleaded guilty to the double murder of 2 of his neighbours and was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. It was the end of the road for the 48-year-old killer who chillingly christened himself the Angel of Mercy. Dawson was no stranger to prison. He'd already served time for murdering a popular shopkeeper in his hometown of Ormskirk in 1981, when he was just 18. Local journalist Clifford Birchall covered the story of the brutal murder in the unassuming town.
Ormskirk in the 80s was just a small country Lancashire town. It had a market that was on the streets twice a week, came alive on those days. It's a small, friendly place. Everybody seemed to know everybody. It was just an ordinary place, just nothing exciting happened very often.
That was all to change in August 1981, when 18-year-old Andrew Dawson entered a small hardware shop owned by popular pensioner Henry Walsh.
From what we learned from the evidence, he'd just gone in, he'd been looking for money, and he thought that Mr. Walsh would be a soft touch. He was, 91 years old. He wouldn't put up much of a fight. He would, do as he was told. But he turned out to have more spirit than Andrew Dawson thought he had. He refused to say where his money was. He refused to help and sort of trying to get him out of the shop, and in the end he paid for it with his life.
After serving 17 years for the crime, Dawson was released in 1999 and settled down in Derby with a wife and 2 children. But just over a decade later, the killer found himself living alone in a flat, and his lust for murder returned. Former detective Paul Callum investigated the killing of 2 of Dawson's neighbours in 2010.
The people that lived in this block of flats and his victims were vulnerable for some reason. Either they're older and they've got ill health, or alcohol problems and this sort of thing. And I think Dawson knew that, and he picked on vulnerable people because he knew that he could overpower them and he knew he could control them.
This killer's story begins in the market town of Ormskirk in Lancashire, in the north of England.
Dawson was born in 1962 and he was one of 6 children. The family were quite impoverished. They didn't have a lot of money. So I think times were pretty tough. He did have a very strict and domineering father, but that's nothing out of the ordinary. And his relationship with his mother doesn't seem to have flagged up any concerns either. So his family life wasn't particularly out of the ordinary.
But even from a young age, Dawson displayed signs that he was in for a life of crime.
He grows up in straitened circumstances in Ormskirk. A boy who wants whatever he wants whenever he wants to get it. When he's 6 or 7, he sees a little girl with money, pennies, literally, and steals them because he can, because he feels he can get away with it, because it doesn't matter.
He had a very acute sense of entitlement. If he wanted something, he would just literally go and take it. There were no moral or ethical boundaries there whatsoever. And I don't think that that behaviour was ever really challenged. There were never really any serious consequences for that. And if there were, he didn't care. So this was somebody who was psychologically not quite normal.
In my view, Dawson was a sociopath from a very, very early age. He did not know responsibility. He did not know moral values. He did not know conscience. He did not know forgiveness. He did not know saying sorry. Grab it. I'm going to take it. It's mine. I want it.
The majority of individuals who commit juvenile crime, petty or otherwise, usually turn themselves around as they mature out of it. The younger someone is when they begin their criminal behavior, the worse the prognosis is, the worse the outcome is. And so when you look at Dawson's background, what stands out to me from a distance is he was involved in crime right from the beginning. He was a problem child right from the start.
As Dawson matured, so did his crimes.
As a teenager, Dawson engaged in property crime. He committed a range of petty thefts, and the victims he would target would be elderly people. And I think he was quite aware of the vulnerability of the elderly, of the fact that they might keep money in their houses or their workplaces.
The burgeoning criminal was soon on the radar of the local authorities.
Andrew Dawson had come to the attention of the police in the past through just petty theft. He was known to them. I don't think they thought he was one of the great criminals of the town, but he was just perhaps more a nuisance than anything else.
There appeared to be nothing obvious in Dawson's young life that justified his criminality.
He had 5 siblings. They're not all committing crimes and killing people. No, it was Dawson. He's the only one. He grew up in the same family with them. The parents treated them, generally speaking, the same according to all the other family members. No, it was Dawson. It's within him. It wasn't an event that happened that created him. It's who he was.
I think there was very much a sense of competition between Dawson and his siblings. There's always that vying for attention, and there are 6 of them. So I think that they're always trying to outdo each other. And that's the case in many large families. But I think Dawson took it a little bit further than most. He had a significantly antagonistic relationship with his brother. He stole money from his brother.
It was the final straw. Dawson's brother reported him to the police, and the young criminal was arrested and charged with theft.
It was enough to have him sent to Borstal for about 6 months. And then sort of when he was released, he came back to Ormskirk, and obviously, hadn't really learnt from his ways. He just carried on as he had before.
Somebody like Dawson and other extraordinary offenders, who particularly those who commit multiple crimes, they see the world differently than the average person. They function in a different sphere. And so where punishment may help somebody straighten themselves out and get on the right track, for somebody like Dawson, it has no effect at all. It just serves as an irritant for him, just makes him angry because he wants to do what he wants to do. That's who he is.
By the age of 18, Andrew Dawson was already a veteran thief, and his time in the youth prison nicknamed Borstal had not curbed his criminal ways. But in August 1981, his life of petty crime would take an even darker turn.
Henry Walsh had been a shopkeeper in the town for a long time. He was an ironmonger. His shop didn't carry a lot of stock, but it was stuff he couldn't find anywhere else. It was sort of a time warp in some ways. He was just a lovable old character.
At some point late on Thursday the 13th of August, Andrew Dawson entered Henry Walsh's shop. By the following morning, locals were concerned for the whereabouts of the 91-year-old.
Mr. Walsh hadn't been seen on the Friday, which was unusual, and somebody was going past, noticed that two big gates which guarded the alley to the rear of the premises, they hadn't been closed all night, and his back door was open, which was unusual.
The passerby dialed 999, and in a matter of moments, Detective Jim Kay arrived at the scene.
I was driving through the town, and the call came over the radio that this back door of the shop was open, and there was no sign of the shopkeeper. So I just turned around the corner. It was a matter of 20 yards, and went into the shop with another officer who arrived. He arrived and I said, just follow me in. You're walking through expecting to find the old man somewhere, maybe collapsed. And to see this man hung on the door is a little bit frightening.
91-year-old Henry Walsh had been hung from coat hooks on the back of a door, tortured and then brutally stabbed to death with a carving knife. It wouldn't be long before news of the beloved elderly man found viciously murdered in his own hardware store got out. It would send shockwaves across the quiet town of Ormskirk, England.
I was in Moore Street, which is one of the main shopping streets, and about 250 yards away at the other end of Moore Street, I could see some unusual police activity. I could see a policeman standing where a policeman wouldn't normally stand, and he wasn't moving, so he was obviously guarding something, so I just acted on my reporter's instinct that something was wrong. So I sort of got there and sort of made some inquiries and ascertained that there had been a suspicious death, and it was Mr. Walsh, so I arranged for a photographer to come out and take a picture that we used in the paper of the police on the scene outside the shop.
Henry Walsh was a nice man. You know, one who I spoke to every time I passed. He would come to the door and say, good afternoon, good morning, and a very pleasant old man.
He was just a really lovable person, and you just couldn't imagine anybody who would have it in them to kill him, to be honest.
News of the 91-year-old's horrific death began reaching the locals. The nature of the crime was unthinkable.
He'd been stabbed with a knife, been stabbed in the chest several times, but he'd also been hung up at the back of a door on some coat hooks, and the last wound, the knife had gone straight through him and embedded itself in the back of the door. It also tied a ligature around his neck, presumably as a way to try and force some information out of him.
The police didn't know it yet, but the killer was an 18-year-old thief named Andrew Dawson, who had seemingly revelled in his first murder.
Dawson didn't just simply kill Henry Walsh. He made this victim suffer. He stabbed him multiple times. Some of the wounds were quite shallow, which is indicative of a torture, of saying, actually, I have power over you, I am in control, and enjoying the reaction of his victim to that. And he hung Henry up on the back of a door. So he's displaying his victim. He's saying, hey, everybody, look at what I've done. Look at what I can accomplish.
You have to ask yourself, what is it that provokes an 18-year-old to kill him, to repeatedly stab him, to pose him, and to leave him? There is something very, very depraved about that. There is something monstrous.
I don't see him targeting a truck driver, a 25-year-old truck driver out there. Well, why isn't he targeting that guy? That guy could have money too. He just made his deliveries. No. Dawson's way too smart for that. He targets somebody old and weak and vulnerable that he knows he can get over on. That's who Dawson is.
Dawson had killed a man 73 years his senior for nothing more than the day's takings from the till and the 91-year-old's pension book.
When police conducted a search of the house later on, they found out that Mr. Walsh did what most old people in those days did. He'd hidden money in and around rooms in the house, and I think they collected about £1,800 in cash, which was quite a lot of money in those days. But I think Andrew Dawson had tried to get him to say where it was, but he refused, which I think perhaps accounts for the ferocity of his attack in the end.
He'd be frightened to death. He was a very timid old man. Not the type of man who'd look for trouble or get involved in trouble. He's only picked on because he was an old man. He wouldn't fight back. I wouldn't have thought.
After taking the life of another man for the very first time, Dawson didn't panic or attempt to flee Ormskirk. Instead, the cocky 18-year-old flaunted his newly acquired riches.
Now, everybody knows he's got no money. And he goes to a pub, a local pub, where he's seen, all of a sudden, feeding lots of coins into the fruit machine. Well, that's rather odd, rather strange. They're immediately going to say, where did you get the money from? It is unbelievably foolish.
He was somebody who was perpetually broke, so this was something that was rather unusual, and that the police eventually catch up with him. And it emerged that Dawson had actually cashed in Henry's pension book for £50 in the days following the murder.
Once Andrew Dawson was arrested, people, in some ways they weren't surprised because they knew he did have a reputation, but I think they were shocked that he could have done such a savage act.
At Preston Crown Court on the 10th of March 1982, Andrew Dawson pleaded guilty to the murder of Henry Walsh. He had told police that he panicked after the 91-year-old had recognised him. In a statement, Dawson said, "I am sorry for what I have done. I had no intention to cause anybody any harm. I wish it was me and not him."
The judge at the Crown Court gave credence to Andrew Dawson's guilty plea, and also the fact that he seemed remorseful to some extent. He was said to have told the police, "I wish it had been me, not him." So the judge did give credence and mentioned this when she was passing sentence.
I'm not convinced by this whatsoever. We've got to remember that this was a young man who'd done a stint in Borstal. He was quite familiar with the types of things that he needed to say to get sympathy, to get attention, and to secure the best outcome for himself.
Dawson, aged just 19 years old, was jailed for life. He had graduated from Borstal to prison, adding murder to his rap sheet.
The mood after a murder trial, it's not exactly one where you say people would glad that a sentence being carried out, but I think more one of relief that justice had been seen to be done, and the fact that the right thing had happened and people were now happy and they were content that the wrongdoing had been punished.
Dawson spent the next 17 years of his life behind bars, but during his time inside, he was no shrinking violet. He reportedly commented on serial killers Peter Sutcliffe and Dennis Nielsen, labelling them as wimps and claiming to be a better man.
When he was in prison, he was comparing himself to other notorious offenders. That's a bad sign. Anytime an offender wants to compare himself to other notorious killers, that's a huge red flag. A sign of rehabilitation is you want to put that part of your life away. You want to show how you're different than other people, not how that you're more extraordinary than some of these notorious people. That's a huge red flag.
In early 1999, Andrew Dawson was deemed ready for release from Sudbury Prison in Derbyshire. Still just 36 years old, it was a chance for him to start a new life.
After his release from prison, Andrew Dawson appeared to have turned over a new leaf. He'd moved to a different area, Derby. He'd met a woman, he'd settled down with her, and they had 2 children together. And from the outside, he appears to be a regular guy. But this was not to last, because Andrew Dawson is a person who is prone to boredom. He has that need for stimulation. He has that hedonistic streak to him. So he starts drinking, and that leads to the breakdown of his marriage.
He's matured now, he's older, maybe he's a different person. But it wasn't long before Dawson reverted to who he was.
Over the next decade, Dawson would continually breach the conditions of his release.
In that period between his divorce in 2003 and 2010, Dawson bumps into the law and is returned to prison on a regular basis 3 times. He's drunk and disorderly, he's violent, he isn't in any kind of control, and he's constantly, therefore, because he's out on licence for the original life sentence, straight back to jail. Almost as inevitably as night follows day, Dawson was going to kill again. It was only a question of when.
By July 2010, Andrew Dawson was estranged from his wife with limited access to his children. He lived alone in a 1-bedroom flat on Waterford Drive just outside of Derby. Former detective Paul Callum worked on the investigation into the sudden death of one of Dawson's neighbours, 66-year-old John David Matthews.
The initial police incident came in at 7 p.m. on the Sunday the 25th of July. Mr. Matthews worked at a local restaurant, and staff at the restaurant had been worried that he'd not turned up for work in the previous week or so. And police officers were called to the flat, and they forced entry, and they found Mr. Matthews' body in the bath downstairs. They looked at Mr. Matthews' body, and unfortunately, because they think he'd been there for a couple of weeks, there was quite a lot of decomposition. And at that time, the incident was recorded as potential suicide.
But the post-mortem told a different story.
Late in the afternoon of Wednesday the 28th of July, I had a phone call from the coroner's office to say that the local pathologist had started the post-mortem of Mr. Matthews, and that he said that there was what he believed were stab wounds.
It was clear this was not a suicide, it was in fact murder. The killer had done his best to cover up the murder.
What he'd done at the crime scene with Mr. Matthews is that after stabbing him, he'd redressed him. So he'd got rid of the shirt that had the stab wounds through it and put a shirt that didn't have any marks on it. He completely changed all his clothing and then put him into the bath. We started doing some early inquiries, and one of those was, what do we have on the electoral register? Who lives there? What intelligence do we have about the block of flats?
Detectives immediately singled out convicted killer Andrew Dawson as a potential suspect.
It very quickly became obvious that Andrew Dawson was going to be our suspect. He had convictions for murder, and he was on licence, and there was some history of a recent assault with somebody else at a previous flat that he'd lived at. So it was reasonably obvious that he was going to be our main focus quite early on. We wanted to secure the scene at Dawson's house, and then obviously our biggest priority was finding out where was Dawson right now.
Whilst detectives launched a manhunt, investigators forced entry into Dawson's flat.
The flat was completely empty, apart from a few items of clothing, but what was particularly interesting about Dawson's flat was it smelt of bleach, and it was very, very clean.
Andrew Dawson was nowhere to be found. He was on the run and presumed to be very dangerous.
We were extremely worried. We obviously knew that a murder had happened at some point before the Sunday the 25th, and looking at the decomposition, we think probably up to 2 weeks before that. So we had nearly a 3-week time period where we had no idea where Dawson had been.
John David Matthews, who was known as Dave, had actually been killed on the 10th of July, stabbed 18 times by his seemingly friendly neighbour Andrew Dawson, who often popped over to use the washing machine.
Dawson arrives at his door with the conventional excuse that he used many times in the block. Can I use your washing machine because mine's broken? Dave lets him in, not suspecting anything. Imagine what must have gone through Dave Matthews' mind. It would have been indescribable, terrifying, reduced him to absolute fear in an instant, and yet there was nothing he could do. Nothing he could do to protect himself against a man who'd come there to kill him, and to kill him for reasons entirely of his own. This was not a motive of greed. This was a motive of the desire to kill.
After Dawson had killed David and left his body in the bath, he actually left the flat because this was the day when he was looking after his children. And he took them out for the day as if nothing had ever happened. And he returned the next day and cleaned up the crime scene and got rid of the blood. Now, for somebody to be able to do this, to be able to function as normal after committing a murder, is something that is very, very rare. I've met a lot of people convicted of murder, and their behaviour in the aftermath is very rarely normal because they're so shocked at the enormity of what they've done that they're unable to function with any degree of normality.
The crime had affected the whole community. As the search for the convicted killer continued, detectives questioned the other neighbours at Waterford Drive. One neighbour even told a story to police of how the killer had been involved in an altercation in his flat.
A resident started telling the investigating officer that had sat down with him to take his statement about the relationship with Dawson and that they used to walk in each other's flats and this sort of thing.
The neighbour went on to describe an incident which had occurred just days before. After inviting Dawson in for a drink, he caught him rifling through his drawers. The neighbour confronted him and Dawson turned nasty.
He was grabbed from behind with an arm around his neck and he felt something in his sort of lower abdomen. He'd sort of thrown Dawson off. Dawson made light of it and said he was just mucking around and this sort of thing. And again, at the time, he didn't particularly think anything of this, but we now know when you listen to the account and you know what Dawson was capable of, that it was likely that he was going to be his first victim.
I think that's only further evidence of the fact that in this small block in Chaddeston, not a lot of flats, that Dawson was by now out of control, completely and utterly out of control. He would attack anyone, driven by his own desire to kill.
On the morning of the 30th of July, detectives received news that Dawson had been spotted in Whitehaven, Cumbria, over 200 miles away from Derby. While local police began to search for the killer, investigations were continuing at the flats. Detectives had accounted for all of Dawson's neighbours, apart from one, 58-year-old Paul Hancock.
So at about 7:30, 8 o'clock, while I was doing the briefing, we got one of the detective sergeants stood at the back of the room and was waving at me, and she came across and whispered to me and said they found another body, and that the officers that were doing the house-to-house inquiries had forced entry to Mr. Hancock's flat and had found him, and he'd also been murdered. We finished the briefing and it started again, and this is when you started to really feel concerned that what had Dawson been doing in that 3-week period that we couldn't account for, and had he killed anybody else?
How many more bodies might turn up at Waterford Drive? It was a frightening thought for the investigators, and they soon had information that revealed the killer had been in the building on the very same day the body of Dave Matthews was discovered.
It turns out on the Sunday afternoon, the call came in about Mr. Matthews. The police had arrived at the flat, and this came out with subsequent inquiries, but it turned out that Dawson was actually upstairs in Hancock's flat when the police arrived. Now, it's possible that he had just committed the murder at that point, or he may have committed the murder over the previous few days and he was there starting to clean up, but we will never really know. But what we do know is that Dawson was in Mr. Hancock's flat when the police arrived. He came downstairs, he spoke to one of the special constables that was there, and he was asked had he seen Mr. Matthews, and he spoke to the police and said that, oh no, he doesn't know him very well, he hasn't seen very much of him. And we then know that within about 10 minutes he'd packed his bag, he'd ordered a taxi, and he'd left the house and had gone to the train station.
Unbeknownst to the police, they had stood face to face with the killer. Since that moment, Andrew Dawson had been on the run for 5 days. But now local police in Whitehaven had located him and were ready to make an arrest.
A uniformed constable comes across Andrew Dawson sleeping on a bench on the seafront in Whitehaven. He might almost have had a sign on his chest saying, "I'm Andrew Dawson and you really want to look at me because I killed 2 people in Derby."
But the police had to proceed with care. They were dealing with a serial killer. Armed with 7 knives in his backpack, Dawson had no intention of giving himself up.
Dawson appeared to want the police to shoot him. He wanted to go down in a blaze of glory and basically occupy a lot of headlines. There's a real kind of dramatic element to this perpetrator. And shortly after he was arrested, he jumped into the sea and he started to swim away. And it really is quite incredible, the behaviour of this man. He soon realised, actually, this probably isn't a good idea, I'm not getting anywhere, and then swam back to shore where the police caught up with him again. It's an attempt at being dramatic. It's an attempt at trying to create this kind of feared persona, but it's one that always falls flat on its face for Dawson.
Dawson is tasered rather than shot. I'm sure he was very upset by that. I'm sure he would much rather that armed response unit had turned up and given him the glory that he wanted.
With Dawson safely in custody, investigators could begin to delve deeper into the 47-year-old killer. After his dramatic arrest in Whitehaven, Cumbria, he'd been brought back down to Derbyshire to be questioned on suspicion of the murders of his neighbours, Dave Matthews and Paul Hancock. The bodies of both victims had been bathed in bleach to hide any forensic evidence. Detectives would have to use all their skills to prove that Andrew Dawson had killed again.
In terms of an investigation, normally you have sort of 36 hours of real urgent work to do, because you have to either have to get enough evidence to charge somebody or you have to release them. Because he was on parole and because of the nature of this, actually from an investigator's point of view, it made the job a little bit easier, because we could recall him to prison, and actually we had a lot of time to make sure that we could get the evidence together and get the case together, which was just as well, because despite it feeling like it was obviously him, you've got to get the evidence to prove that. And forensically, it was very, very challenging.
On the same day of Dawson's arrest, police had discovered the body of 58-year-old Paul Hancock. Just like his neighbour Dave Matthews, Paul had been found stabbed to death in his own bathtub.
With Mr. Matthews, the flat had been cleaned. There was a lot of bleach poured into the bath. It had clearly been tidied up. And with Mr. Hancock's, it was very dishevelled. It had been very rushed. There was clothing in the bath, there was weapons in the bath, there was all sorts of bits of gloves, marigold gloves and this sort of thing. All the drawers had been through the house, and we know that money was stolen and various other items. And apart from the fact that there was bodies in the bath and they'd been stabbed, the two scenes were totally different.
It's believed that Dawson was still cleaning up the crime scene when the police had discovered the body of Dave Matthews across the hall. Dawson likely panicked and threw his clothes into the bath of bleach to kill any forensic evidence.
On the yellow trousers that he was wearing, there was a slash mark on the right-hand side, on the right leg. Dawson also had an injury to his right leg, and it's impossible to actually match that to the injury, but again, it's very likely that he was wearing those trousers when he committed the murder. So he's very forensically aware, so I think he had a system, he had a type of clothing that he wore to make sure that he doesn't get contaminated with blood, and then he went and commits the murders, and then he bleaches them and gets rid of any evidence.
Bleach indicates forensic awareness. Bleach is one of those things that wipes up a great deal of forensic evidence. Dawson's been a career criminal. He's been in prison his entire life. He knows what bleach does. He was in the juvenile center, but he also went to state prison. That's like graduate school for crime. All criminals do all day is talk about their crimes and how they got caught and this and that and how to avoid law enforcement. So the fact that he used bleach doesn't surprise me at all. It just reflects what he learned in prison and how to try to avoid detection.
With Dawson being held in custody indefinitely, it gave detectives more time to study the crime scene at Dave Matthews' flat.
When we first searched Mr. Matthews' house, there was a few items that we didn't really understand. One of them was a rose that was on the pillow in Mr. Matthews' bedroom, and it was just an old red rose. The other thing was, when we searched Dawson's flat, there was a blank notepad. But you could see indentations on it.
This suggested that a note had been written on the sheet of paper above. If experts could decipher the faint indentations, it could be a huge clue.
About 3 weeks after that inquiry had been sent off, I got a phone call from our forensic team, really excited. And they said, they were saying, boss, this is amazing, this is fantastic. We've got a confession. And I said, what are you talking about? And it turned out that he'd written a letter to the police. And it was to the head of homicide, it said. And he wrote this poem, very badly spelled, but the poem talked about in a bath in Waterford Drive, there lies a man, and he talked about if in 2 weeks' time you don't know about it, I will come and report it to the police. And he talked about the rose being the nice touch, and he signed it, the Angel of Mercy. Really, really chilling, but very, very important key bit of evidence.
Dawson had signed the note with a chilling moniker.
The confession letter that police had come across had been signed the Angel of Mercy, and I think this is really testament to Andrew Dawson's narcissism. He wanted a brand, he wanted an identity, he wanted infamy, and I think this was very much part of that. He wants that recognition for the things that he's done.
He's pretending to be significant. He's not. He's an insignificant, horrid, horrible, depraved, monstrous killer, but not in his mind.
As investigations continued, more evidence was uncovered at Dave Matthews' flat.
In Mr. Matthews' house, there was very, very little forensic evidence in there, in terms of fingerprints, DNA, and this sort of thing. He had destroyed most of the evidence, but we found a marigold glove in the bath that had the thumb missing on it. And part of the forensic strategy was to find this piece of rubber from the thumb.
Paul knew that finding the tip of the glove may finally yield some forensic evidence.
So the whole house was completely emptied. We spent weeks there, meticulously going through everything in the lounge, and the scenes of crime team found the tip of the marigold glove. And we think that it probably got caught in a drawer while he was stealing property from the flat, and it had snapped off. And in this small piece of the thumb, and it was the tiny piece of the thumb there, they managed to recover some DNA, which proved that it was Andrew Dawson, which was a very, very significant piece of evidence because forensically we had very, very little. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but little forensic evidence.
In total, 5,000 items were seized from the flats at Waterford Drive. However, only one of these provided the conclusive forensic evidence investigators needed. This new discovery undoubtedly connected Dawson with the murder of Paul Hancock. In interviews with investigators, Andrew Dawson initially confessed to both murders.
He talked about Mr. Matthews being a nice man. He talked about how he didn't really want to kill him, but he just felt that he had to, and he had an urge to do it. And this was what's particularly chilling and very frightening about Mr. Dawson. There didn't seem to be any particular motive other than a desire to kill somebody. So in that respect, you tell me someone's mental state, that's quite worrying. Certainly, I dealt with a lot of murder inquiries for all sorts of different reasons. But to have somebody that said they just had an urge to do it is very, very frightening.
By the time of his court hearing in July 2011, Dawson had changed his story, denying the murders and pleading not guilty. But he didn't hide behind his lies for long.
You saw it in court. He was very, very impatient. He didn't like to wait around. He liked a very impetuous sort of character. For example, at court, he pleaded not guilty, and after a couple of hours, he looked like he got bored, and he had a word with his solicitor and just said, "Oh, I can't be bothered. I'll plead guilty," and that was the court case, and that was kind of the way I think he was.
This is a tactic that we see with a lot of offenders like Dawson. They enjoy playing with people, they enjoy manipulating people, they enjoy having everybody running around, sorting things out, and then they chuck a grenade in and cause chaos. And I think that's exactly what he was doing here.
In total, Andrew Dawson stabbed Dave Matthews 18 times and Paul Hancock 22 times. He had received a fairly lenient sentence after his first murder in Ormskirk in 1981. But there would be no similar result for him this time.
The judge, Mrs. Justice Dobbs, gave Dawson a whole life tariff. Life will mean life in your case. She told Dawson in sentencing These were premeditated and planned, brutal killings. Each had the misfortune of being your neighbour who had no chance.
Relief, I think, more than anything. But there wasn't, there's no particular reason to sort of celebrate or anything like that. It's just, really sad for the victims of the family. These were both victims were just, regular people that were trying to live their life and hadn't particularly upset anybody. In fact, both have been described as very pleasant people that just sort of kept themselves to themselves. So very, very sad.
Andrew Dawson remains in prison and will never be released. Some experts believe that he was never rehabilitated after his first murder conviction and should never have been in a position to be able to kill 2 more innocent victims.
For me, what makes this case exceptional is the failure to realise how serious the first murder was. It was interpreted as a homicide during the course of a robbery, but actually it was much, much worse than that. This individual had been tortured, essentially. The time that the perpetrator had spent with the victim was quite significant, and the perpetrator was only 18 years old. So I think this was a massive red flag for further potential violence, and even though he was convicted of murder, there was not enough work done to address what led to that.
I think that there is a case that sort of some people are so dangerous that they can't be allowed out again, out of prison. It seems a harsh thing to condemn somebody to die in prison, but I think some people, never learn and never alter. I think it's one of those things that sometimes you have to do it. And this is, probably one of those cases.
Dawson was a selfish killer who had no regard for his victims. The only reason he's ever given for his horrific crimes is that he had an urge to kill.
When we look at the crimes of Andrew Dawson, they are so horrendous that many people say this could only be the workings of a madman. But unfortunately, they're not. This is an individual who knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that what they were doing was wrong, and they carried on doing it anyway.
It's conventional to talk about serial killers as having a trigger. Sometimes it's in their childhood, sometimes it's a moment in their adolescence. I don't believe there was such a trigger to Andrew Dawson. I think there was something in him from the very beginning that led him to commit these heinous crimes.
I dealt with a lot of suspicious deaths and a lot of murder inquiries. There weren't many that kept me awake at night. This guy kept me awake at night because you just had this feeling that you had to get the evidence. You had to put him away because he was an absolute danger to anybody in society. I think this idea that you can suddenly get an urge to kill someone clearly makes you extremely dangerous, doesn't it?
Dawson is a killer who murdered innocent people for his own depraved enjoyment. He may have started out as a petty thief, but that was an unlawful livelihood that didn't satiate his urges. He needed something more to satisfy his twisted mind. His lust for murder and the pleasure he gets from it are what makes Andrew Dawson one of the world's most evil killers.